Okay, we were in the midst of paragraph 78, and I detoured into the preface, paragraphs 28, 29, and the two thoughts from paragraphs 28, 29 I wanted to bring out. One on the bottom of page 16, when Hegel says, in this respective formative education, regarded from the side of the individual, consists in his acquiring what thus lies at hand, devouring his inorganic nature, and taking possession of it for himself. So the process of the education, which is going to be the reading of the book, is going to be catching up with our own inorganic nature, that is, the history that is already sedimented in us. And if I can use a Husserlian phrase here, this would be a reactivating of the origin. You think of that great account in The Origin of Geometry, where he says, what lies behind 2 plus 3 equals 4, and he goes all the way back to the Greeks and walking fields and things like that. Well, similarly, there's this idea that, to use Gadamer's phrase, we are more being than consciousness. That's what he means by our inorganic nature. We are more being than consciousness. And the way in which we're more being is all that history is simply sedimented in us and comes out as our capacity to do the simplest sorts of things. For example, we simply know, without kind of problematically thinking about it, that the Earth revolves around the Sun. Although none of us actually seen that, we actually always see the opposite. We always see the Sun, right? But we've got that. We don't need the whole history of the controversies. So for what took people centuries to discover, what people went to jail for, what they were killed for, we have as a bit of common sense knowledge. And the common sense knowledge is the tip of the iceberg. That's what Gadamer means by we are more being than consciousness. And we have to take possession of that history. So Hegel says at the end of paragraph 29, turning this now into Hegelese jargon, it is no longer existence in the form of being in itself, neither still in the original form of an abstract concept nor submerged in existence, but now it is now the recollected in itself, ready for conversion into the form of being for self. How this is done, we shall come to. So it's a recollected in itself that is to be made, brought to consciousness. So when he says in paragraph 78, going back to it, that the series of configurations which consciousness goes through along this road is in reality the detailed history of the education of consciousness itself from the standpoint of science. It means we are now going to watch natural consciousness going through this educative process. An educative process that is manifest in us, right, by its being our inorganic nature. Now, part of what makes this education possible, Hegel says, toward the end of that paragraph, is that he is going to have as we've already been told, a skeptical method. And he says the skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is. So he's going to be claiming that he's got a skeptical method that's deeper, darker, more dangerous, more thorough than Descartes'. But he's referring to the skeptical method, he's referring to Montaigne, to Descartes, and he is himself going to be employing a skeptical method. But he says a skeptical method that is going to go against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness. And because it does so, and here he, as it were, gets down and dirty, it brings about a state of despair about all the so-called natural ideas, thoughts, opinions, regardless of whether they are called one's own or someone else's, ideas with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straight away is still filled with and hampered, so that it is, in fact, incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. He's here going right back to the beginning of the introduction, in which he had already shown himself skeptical about modern skeptical methods. And we discovered last time that he was skeptical about modern skeptical methods because they were not serious enough. And the reason why they're not serious enough is because they always presume a point of safety and security, namely consciousness itself. Whether it is the cogito, the exemplar of the moment of absolute security or safety, or all the empiricists. I'm immediately aware of impressions. I'm immediately aware of ideas in the mind. I'm immediately aware, and this goes right through the French encyclopedists, right? No one in the 17th or 18th century ever thought to question the transparency of ideas before the mind. That was a given. That was a given. And Hegel says, if you help yourself to that, then you can't be serious. Because what we need to question is what it means to have, for example, an idea in the mind. So it's at this point where Hegel is thinking of the model of ancient skepticism as opposed to modern skepticism. And again, just to remind you, ancient skepticism was the practice of trying to show that of two opinions, each was equally plausible and implausible. And that to show that no side of a serious debate about a problem of knowledge could be shown to be true. So ancient skepticism had the method of equipollence, is what it's called, the method of trying to find a balance of we nowadays call a balance of terror on each side of the debate. And of course, for them, but not for Hegel, this was actually part of an ethical exercise. Because for them, the idea was, if you learned that you could not have the truth, that there was always good reasons to believe and not to believe, then the right thing to do would be to suspend belief. If you could suspend belief, you could reach a point of equilibrium, what they call ataraxia, which is a state of calmness and acceptance of the world, because there was no truth to be had about it. Hegel wrote on this. Michael Forster's written a whole book about Hegel and skepticism, giving an account of his own writings, so that Hegel was clearly aware, Forster's made the argument, small man with a small mind, but he's made his thought absolutely indubitable. I like his book on the idea of phenomenology. And there's no doubt that he had this view of ancient skepticism in view. So he wanted, and this is what lies behind his search here, to find a method of skepticism that would avoid the traps of modern skeptical methods, right, of which the paradigm is the first meditation. I doubt, you give the reasons for doubt and going all the way back to the evil demon. Skeptical method, trying to show you're assuming or presupposing nothing. What Hegel wants is a general skeptical method. And hence he wants to have a method in which he throws doubt over everything. And therefore, nothing is taken for granted within this method. Having that thought is what leads people to think that Hegel has a presupposition, the starting point, which I will refute in about 17 minutes. Nonetheless, it's a skeptical method. So how is his skeptical method going to differ in the first instance from the Cartesian empiricist skeptical method? And the answer is given in the next paragraph when he wants to say that we're going to be doubting, we already know, forms of consciousness. Whatever forms of consciousness means, we don't know that yet. But he's used that phrase. We're doubting natural consciousness. Let's call it natural consciousness for the moment. And we're going to doubt all the different forms of natural consciousness as they arise. And he says that this series of skeptical doubts, each doubt will bring us to a moment of despair. If you hold any of these views, you will find yourself in despair. That the series of this will be a progression, a narrative of a kind, an interconnection. And he says, and again, this is again very Cartesian, by following every falsity, this is false, 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 we'll bump into the truth. When there's nothing left, or we can't negate any more, that it will bring us to that moment of truth. So he does take, so this is a kind of via negativa, but not quite, for reasons we'll come to, because it's also a Bildung. And that will be the double-sidedness of it, both a wholly negative process and a Bildung at the same time. And therefore, there better be at least 2 points of view from which we tell this story. If we're going to have nothing but skepticism all the time and education all the time. So you already know there are going to be at least 2 points of view. Right? And that the story will have to be double-voiced. And there has to be not only double-voiced, but for reasons that every reader of the modern novel understands, namely the biographical form precipitates autobiographical form. Back to that, you'll have to be triple voiced. So, it's going to be a negative progression, a series that will bring to pass the completion of the series. That's the hope. And of course, he expects us to have in mind, as he says this, either, and he doesn't care, right? You can think either Cartesianly, you're going to get to something, or you can think negative theology, you're going to get to something, but he's thinking that we're used to this idea that the negative can take us this way. Now, he now gives it an extra twist, and he says, well, our form of pathology, which I mentioned last week is of a particular kind. Namely, what makes us pathological creatures is our one-sidedness. Remember my claim last week that the pathologies of modernity are a series of one-sidedness that could not be reconciled. So mind versus body, man versus nature, individual versus society, faith versus reason. Right on down the line, we have these series of dualisms, and it's the irreconcilability of those dualisms that generates the crises of modernity. But because we are alive, and none of us are ancient skeptics, none of us are capable of ataraxia, we are bound to one side or the other. So we are either, to use a famous phrase, dogmatists or skeptics. That is, we are either someone who feels, no, I know it's, but I'm going to go with the revolution and the terror. As Fichte did, right? Jacobin to the end. Or the problem of skepticism. So the one side is, so the skepticism is going to be of a peculiar kind. The skepticism is going to have to show that what's wrong with the forms of natural consciousness is their one-sidedness, which means that one-sidedness is always taking a partial truth for the whole. That is, the mistake for Hegel is the substitution of the part for the whole. After all, he's the guy who said the true is the whole. So he's bound to say, going backwards, that the form of pathology is the taking of the part for the whole. That's what every position you will find, will come across, will be doing. That is, reifying a partial truth so that it becomes the whole truth, which is to say that every previous philosophical position is a caricature. Right? It exaggerates a half-truth and makes it everything, which is why, again, philosophy is inherently comical. That is, there's something laughable about philosophical thought. If you don't giggle when you read Berkeley, you're not reading the same book I'm reading, which isn't to say, read Branko Arsich's great book on Berkeley, that Berkeley is one of the darkest thinkers of the modern epoch. Arsich's book is devastating about the notion of passivity and exhaustion. It's the best reading Berkeley ever, I think. But it's also, again, as Arsich would know as well as anyone, comical. And this book is in part the reversals, as you will see, have one of the reasons I like Hegel is for a German philosopher, he has a sense of humor. Notion of reversal is common. Okay, so the notion of skepticism is to overcome one-sidedness. So the skepticism is a skepticism of overcoming positions, but the positions are themselves going to be reification of one-sided views until we overcome those and we are not tempted by such one-sidedness again. That's the first thing we want to aim at. The second thing he now says is that the via negativa is not a via negativa because the issuing of a skeptical doubt for example, just saying that a particular theory is false because it's contradictory. I want to be clear. In logic, a contradiction entails what? Someone's here taking a logic exam. What?
Nothing follows.
Anything follows. Right? The problem with contradictions, right, is that from saying, the tree is green, the tree is not green, I'm entitled to say the frog is purple. It's bad news, right? Now, the notion is that contradiction can't get us anywhere. Therefore, if we're discovering internal contradictions in positions, part of a skeptical method, then we're just going to end up each time with nothing. Right? Now, that is a truth of logic. So when Hegel here now suggests that he has a different view in mind, he's saying that he's no longer following the rules of formal logic, either as it was, he inherited it from Aristotle, or that it now exists in Fregean form. Because he says that the negation of a position, discovery of a contradiction, yields and it sounds now, if you're a logician, like an oxymoron, a determinate nothingness. Determinate nothingness. Now, in this, and a determinate nothingness which has a content. So he claims that this is the theory of determinate negation. And I'll be giving details of it in a second. But the intuitive thought here is in fact that Hegel is operating much, much more like an ordinary scientist than like a logician. For a scientist, when they test out a theory and it gets refuted by the evidence, so it has a prediction, I predict X, and shown holds not X, so I've got a contradiction, X not X, they don't think, oh, I've got nothing, right? They think, wait a minute. There must be a mistake in the theory. Why did we go wrong? Let's cook up a new theory to explain why this one went wrong, and that will account for the facts we missed. The first person to try to think of this it can't be formalized, but the way in which pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce, who was an Hegelian, at least for a moment, thought of it, came with the idea of abductive inference, which is a typical Peircean unreadable phrase. So everyone else uses a much nicer phraseology, inference to the best explanation. Hegel's thought, and I'll say it in a little bit how it's done. Hegel's thought is, and this is why I think for years, certainly throughout the 60s and 70s, if you wanted to beat up on Hegel, the first place you went was the idea of determinate negation. Because it was just clear he was a bad logician. Namely, he was tolerating contradictions, and he said they went somewhere, right? And it just gave people who went to Oxford reasons better to read Hegel. And this was the reason why. Determinate negation was the reason why. Now, my suggestion is the notion of determinate negation is actually part of a standard empirical method. Once we are no longer naive about how science works and how theories work, and how, as thinkers, we try to develop explanatory accounts of experience at any level, any kind of science, we're always going to be fixing things up, and that is, we're going to take it that refutations are a spur to generate a new version of our theory. And the new version of our theory will always have the minimum capacities to explain what the former position could not explain, and do so on the basis of pointing to what its weakness was. So it can't be ad hoc. So the debate here now would be the question of whether these acts of determinate negation, Hegel does talk a lot about necessity. And the question is, what kind of, so this is the necessity of transition, right? To move from one form of natural consciousness to another. And Hegel seems to claim at various moments that the movement forward is some form of necessity. If I'm right in thinking that it's inference to the best explanation, it won't be necessary. But let me say a word about this. At least one plausible account, there are varieties. In Forster's book on the idea of phenomenology, he gives a fairly detailed account on page 186. I'm going to go for a shorter account in Pippin on page 108. What we're asking is we have some theory A that failed, and we want to understand the status of B, which is going to be the successor theory. So since you've all been reading a little bit ahead, I assume, this is sense certainty, this is perception. What makes perception follow from sense certainty? At the very least, and here would be the strongest version, Pippin says, is to argue that given the internal difficulties of A, B is the only possible resolution of those difficulties, and so represents a necessary correction to A. So B is the only possible. Why may you not want to argue that? Those of you who've done 17 years of logic.
It's a fallacy for denying the
Well, but how about the only possible? Of course, it's not a logical inference. We know that. That's why he calls it abductive. We know it's not a logical inference. It would be for many. But why is this going to be, even on its own terms, impossibly strong? Yeah?
You've got to go through and demonstrate what each and every possible... I mean, it's like proving something doesn't exist. It's,
exactly right. It's proving an existential negative, which is really hard to do. You follow that? You've got to prove that there... it's not that there is a counterexample that you have to show. You have to show that there can be no possible counterexample to it. So you have to prove a negative existential. And that turns out, that's an impossibly strong criterion. So that cannot be, and that's the only way, by the way, I want to be clear about this, that an abductive inference could be necessary. So whatever Hegel means by necessary, it better not be that. I'm glad I'm having fun here. No one else is. Do this for years, you find various things amusing. So a weaker version of the argument. I mean, this is a graduate course on undergraduate stuff. We want to get this stuff right. The weaker version is to say that B does resolve the inadequacies of A in the appropriate way, and issues a challenge to any potential objector to provide a better resolution. So not that B is the only possible, but simply that B does do the work of accounting for it. And I'm going to actually add another counter. Not only that B does that, but in each and every case we will discover that B is an available historical position. So what Hegel's roughly claiming is that for every successor form of consciousness, he's looking for an account that does follow, does explain the failures of the earlier one, and is one we actually already have in our repertoire of positions that people have held about these matters. It then follows, of course, so these really are inferences. In my case, these are inferences of best explanation under conditions of historical provinciality. Or, so going forward, I want to be absolutely clear, there is no necessity. Just like going forward, there is no necessity in any narrative. The necessity, when it arises, will arise from the endpoint, and lo and behold, the next paragraph, that's what Hegel says. That is, if you think of it as narrative, the necessity will have to be retrospective necessity. So, I'll explain why, but as my friend Julian Rose used to say, going forward, the phenomenology is a gamble, and retrospectively, it's a necessity. Why necessary? Because when we get to the end point, and then we have to know that there can be an end point, what that end point is, but if we can reach an end, then the path from A to B to C to D to the end shows that it was, those were the moves we needed to make in order to get here. So like any narrative story, we have to show the steps by which we can get to the end. Well, what would be the end? Minimally. Not what he says. What would be the end minimally? A kind of naive, let's call it a naive Proustian sense. What's the minimal condition for this book ending? Yeah. It has to make possible that it was written at all. So this is an education of consciousness to the point of view. So this is a portrait of the artist as a young consciousness. Proustian, I mean, that's why I have students in Boston working on Proust, Hegel, PhDs. It's one of those obvious kind of topics. Why? Because the end of the book must be the conditions of it being written at all. So consciousness reaching the standpoint of what he calls absolute knowing, right? The goal. But the goal will be now that you can see how you got to the position whereby you could overview this whole process and see yourself as the result of it, and see that going through this process is what allowed you to write this book. So in that sense, the book is nothing but a historical recapitulation of its own conditions of possibility. So yeah, it has to go back to the beginning in exactly that sense. Yes?
So I get it right. You want to say these conditions of possibility are themselves historical?
Absolutely. Well, but that has to be discovered. And that will give us a problem with, again, perspectives and standpoints and all of that. It will turn out that although we're going to start with natural consciousness, which is say we're going to start with, let's call it egoology. We're going to start with the view that there are individuals who face a world. We're going to discover, as we already know from spiritual Christianity, that's not true. That individuals don't just face a world. Individuals are parts of historical communities, and therefore the story is going to have to run consciousness discovering that it is not the measure of all things, that spirit is the measure of all things, and then spirit has to go through a history to get to the point where spirit is the kind of spirit that allows, people like Mr. Hegel to write that kind of philosophy book. So this is going to be a spiraling story of where, and in this sense, maybe more like a Virginia Woolf novel than Proust, in the sense that there's going to be masquerade, right? That you're going to start with someone who looks like a consciousness and looks like a man, and then it's going to become an 18th century scientist, and then it's going to become a woman in Greece, and then it's going to become the characters are going to change. And the very meaning of what it is to be a character are going to change. Right? So it's going to be rich in that way. That's not exactly what he says at the beginning of paragraph 80. He says something much more modest, but the modesty for me is terribly important. Because what he gives is a formal and not substantive account of ending. Right? But the goal is as necessarily fixed for knowledge as the serial progression. It is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where notion corresponds to object and object to notion. So, you don't know what that means yet. But at some point, it's where whatever natural consciousness is supposing about the world, at that point, it turns out it works out okay. And therefore, there's no unfulfilled desires, there's no further negations to make. You can just relax. Okay. So not unlike ataraxia in that way. You've kind of, you've got your desires satisfied. However, short of that moment, life is hell. That's what he goes on to say. Because and this is something we don't have an understanding of, and it will actually be weeks before we get a rich enough conception of consciousness to understand it fully. But he says that the progress is unhalting until we get there because no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations on the way. That is, so he's given you a standard correspondence theory of truth. We can stop when object corresponds to notion and notion to object, whatever that means. That sounds like correspondence theory of truth. And then he suddenly adds a wholly affective erotic dimension. Namely, that prior to that moment when that formal criteria is satisfied, there'll be no satisfaction subjectively. That is, there will be a restlessness of consciousness, so that consciousness itself will be tearing itself to pieces, forcing itself to go on. And then he says, well, of course, there are various ways, forms of self-deception that allow you to stop, but eventually they will collapse too, and you will be forced to go on. So he presumes that this forward motion now is both, let's call it, logical and erotic. where the notion of a quest would be one version of an erotic pursuit. The other might be the ascent in the Republic as an erotic pursuit, symposium, those models. But he's certainly suggesting that knowledge has something to do with desire, and what we're looking for is a certain kind of satisfaction, and that's going to have something to do with the picture of subjectivity at stake here. That is, to get the right kind of account is also going to be the kind of account that provides us, as modern subjects, with the kind of self-understanding that means we are, remember our starting point, no longer in crisis, no longer feeling alienated from our world, no longer torn to pieces. And we'll see that various forms of consciousness are literally described as torn to pieces in various ways. Or to put it another way, we will not be compelled to participate in any further self-defeating performances, because all previous forms of natural consciousness will be forms of self-defeating performances. That's what those structures will be. Okay. Deep breath. Are there any questions there? Because, as it were, Hegel starts the whole thing all over again in paragraph 81. Does the same analysis at the level, he's now done it at the level of consciousness, he now does it at the level of self-consciousness. So it's a kind of double movement introduction. We all, on the same page up to here, have some idea of how this is supposed to work itself out.
I'm sure we'll get to it, but maybe you can just throw forward and let me ask, what allows the various moments to actually be articulate and distinct from each other, so that each failure is actually a distinct failure and recognized as progression, as opposed to the repeating of the same kind of failure? If that makes sense. Like, how do we know that we're actually making progress when we go from A to B?
Oh, no, that's not the question. You want a better question. No. The question from A to B I already answered, right? B will be progress over A just in case it resolves the contradictions in A and does so on the basis of giving us insight into the mistakes in A. So getting from A to B is easy. The question that arises, what you said is rightly the question of progress, right, is whether these are transitive. Right? This is the big problem with historical theories of natural science. Right? You can, the question, what do I mean by that? Is it transitive?
Is C is much better than A as B was?
Exactly. So you know that B is better than A, and C is better than B, but does it follow from that C is better than A? Because unless C is better than A, then you're not making progress, you're just kind of going through bumps, right? And this was the great anxiety that arose when historical accounts of physics first arose, the Kuhnian, Lakatos, Bayrov-Endian accounts. Right? And what do you suppose Hegel's answer is going to be, given what I've just said? How does Hegel get transitivity into the story? Get to the end. You ain't going to get there until the end. So your question is exactly right, which is why I said up until the end it's a gamble. At any moment that failure is possible, and that the method has to allow for this. Transitivity is not built into the overall structure of the account. That is, it doesn't give transitive accounts. Although there are to say, mini compensations for the absence of transitivity. Namely, you will feel at certain moments, which is why people stop reading the book at various moments, as if you've reached an end. And there's a way in which the parts sometimes feel bigger than the whole in reading this text, because they feel like real microcosms of the whole, and in a way they are. So that I want to say, and this, by the way, is, I'm just reading for the first time, so I can't tell you how good the whole book is. The first 25 pages is pretty good. John Russin was reading Hegel's Phenomenology. I'll bring it up occasionally because I haven't read it before. This is the only commentary I haven't read, so I'm reading it. And Russin has the thought that you can read the book in a way happily non-cumulatively by thinking about how each section has a kind of microcosm structure, microcosm-macrocosm structure. And he's not implausible. So that part of the satisfactions is you feel like you know what the end is going to be before you get there, because it's so heavily adumbrated in various ways by the nature of the individual failures. But I want to say that that's a fool's paradise. It's true, but it is a fool's paradise. The real notion of transitivity is because of the end. Right? So if Hegel couldn't write the book or couldn't complete the book, right? I mean, think what an odd book Remembrance of Things would be if it ended just with writer's block. We really wouldn't know how to read it even. I mean, it would be very odd. Right? So that's something about that structure of that book, right, has about it a certain type of necessity given the very nature of the question it's on. Right? And as we know very, very early on, that this is a portrait of how Marcel becomes a writer. Right? All the things are there right away in Swann's Way, and the story with the musician. Anyway, we heard the melody by Bontoy. Thank you. I'm glad someone's literate here, not me. So the Bontoy theme, we already know that what this is going to be about from that. Right? Well, same here. We kind of know, kind of, although again the surprises are pretty stern, and Hegel's readers would not have known where he was going to end up at all. They're in for big surprises in ways I'll explain. So transitivity, the notion where it's really progressive, not till the end. Only the end gives it back the necessity. Roxy?
I agree with the end giving it necessity, but as for transitivity, couldn't one say that, I mean, Hegel puts a lot of effort into giving the appearance that everything is already there from the beginning. And therefore, once you reach the end, it seems like a necessary progression. But he works a lot on giving you those little steps and realizing, it was already there. We've already had that. Couldn't the transitivity at least somewhat follow from that? Not in the sense of value necessarily, but in the sense of transition. Not necessarily a necessity either.
Except that, two things. He's actually, say, as we know this book is, it's a memory book. Okay? It's a remembrance of philosophy past. It's going to be a bit of a memory book. So, and we give this story about inorganic nature. It's already here. So in some way, he does want to claim it's making the implicit explicit. He is going to claim it's drawing things out. All those are right metaphors, except they don't account for the logical character of the book. The logical character of the book still has to come up to this criteria, or it fails. Right? So no matter, so even if I don't remember ever being in the spiritual animal kingdom, that's not important. It's got to have a certain logical character, and I've got to be able to consider it as having certain historical pedigree. so the criteria turn out to be those are ways of trying to get you to think about the process as a seduction in the preface, but he needs this. Yeah, Adam?
I guess I'm wondering about even characterizing the end in it, because the criteria you gave us is that it can make sense of the fact that it is, how it came about. So it has to be able to account for the standards that make sense to it in light of everything that came before.
Right.
But I guess my thought is, like, I was late, and I could give you a whole narrative about why I was late. Because, I was at the airport, and there was all these things happening. But couldn't I give you several different narratives about how I got here, and according to the kind of narrative necessity we're talking about? And of course, once I got on the express bus, and, the driver was a little slow, then, it follows that I'm going to be late. However, I could have taken the air train, and...
So, this is the cost. Now, here's the way to answer. I mean, that's absolutely what you say is true. And that's the cost of dropping necessity, only possible, and going with not a necessary but a sufficient explanation. So what that does, however, is although it generates necessity, it doesn't give it the character of logical indefeasibility. What it does, and what it must do, is it turns out there's some further criteria. It must account for all the standard philosophical prejudices of all the members of its philosophical audience, and it must give all of them reasons to move from their partial perspective to a fuller perspective. So it has to address its audience. And if it can do that, and if it can satisfy all these criteria, then, again, still not logically feasible, what it has done is simply issued a massive onus probandi. That's all you can do. Speak loud. I mean, all you can do is show that now all the weight is on someone else who wants to argue differently. That you have nothing further you need to do for your position. If someone wants to come up with another position, they've got to show why your account fails their perspective. So that becomes then the standard Hegelian form. Kierkegaard says, no, I'm not in there. And us, Hegelians say, oh, yes, you are. You're right here. Write you right in there. There you are. Unhappy consciousness. You're done. Next. And but that is what after all, so you're right. It doesn't have the character of a rationalist system, and it cannot have the character of a full-scale rationalist system, precisely because its acceptance of the inevitability of contingency. Right? The necessity of contingency means that it can never attain the status of logical indefeasibility, and therefore can't even do a transcendental deduction. Why I don't like even the thought that he was attempting to do a transcendental deduction, because that makes no sense of the role of contingency in the argument.
But just for the claim about, I guess this is where I want to talk about logical indefeasibility and satisfaction. Because what's great about the end is that we're finally satisfied in some fundamental way, right? So when you mean that there's no logical indefeasibility, you mean no finality. That it's perfectly possible someone else could come along and say, look, the standards you just reconstructed don't make any sense at all, and here's why. And so, you're back in the fray again. So I guess that's the worry.
But I'm saying that part of the satisfaction will be learned to discover that that's not let's call it, what does Putnam call that? It's the skeptical induction, right? That every theory, and the skeptical induction Putnam says is, we know from the past that every theory has been proved false, therefore we know that every future theory will be false. Even if that's logically true, which it is, right? I want to suggest, or I'll try to convince you, that Hegel gives us reasons to think that that kind of objection should not disturb us. That's the wrong level and the wrong kind of skeptical doubt. That kind of skeptical doubt, so the capacity to feel satisfaction in the Hegelian sense, is also learning about what I said in the very first lecture is the disappointment of knowledge. That knowledge doesn't provide all the forms of security or defense or certainty that many people have thought knowledge did. And knowing that is part of what absolute knowing is. That is, knowing about knowledge is knowing what knowledge can't do. Right? I mean, isn't that the story of like 90,000 Hollywood movies? I know exactly what it is to find the perfect wife. You know, and of course, I failed miserably, right? Because knowledge and practice fall apart. I mean, we all know that there's certain things that the sort of what knowledge can do is illusory. And this book begins, I want to say, with certain framings of the limits of knowledge, and it's going to turn out the framing is going to be very powerful because it will turn out that we're not essentially knowers. So absolute knowing is the knowledge of us as non-knowers, namely as historical agents in complex social worlds who live in accordance with complicated, communal norms, so on and so forth. So, it's not going to be that knowledge. So our knowledge of ourselves, we need knowledge about ourselves as essentially non-knowers. So that begins. But these are absolutely the right kinds of questions we should be, kind of feeling. I mean, to feel that, yeah.
Does this then allow for the possibility that we could get to the end through a different series of provisions?
Yeah. Absolutely. If you think some fundamental moment is missing, or something wrong about science or nature, or history or politics, or maybe you think he can't reach the end, or maybe you think reaching the end doesn't leave him where he thinks he leaves him. There's all sorts of possibilities. And those, I really want to say, has to do with the kind of demonstration it is. So I want to insist upon that level of openness. Okay, we've already gone an hour, and I have not yet begun. That's always dangerous. And I do want to finish the introduction today. So let's have a 10-minute break, and then I'm going to go right through the method itself, which by now will turn out to be much easier because we've got a lot of stuff already going. Daniel just reminded me, quite rightly, that we do have a bad version of ancient skepticism in the modern epoch in consentinities. Space has an end, it doesn't have an end. There's no end to the causes, there's an end to causes, there's the first cause. And Hegel was very, very infatuated with those antinomies and did find, so that the antinomies are a model, right, of finding both views equally strong and equally false. And we know that Kant solves them only by phenomena noumena, which is the very thing that Hegel is going to doubt. but certainly consentinomies are part of the origins of Hegel's idea of dialectic. Paragraph 81 brings up the problem of criterion, and because we know that Hegel did write this early essay on ancient versus modern skepticism, then we know he knew about ancient skepticism, and therefore when he raises the problem of criterion, we can be near as damn certain that he's thinking of the problem of criterion as raised by Sextus in his outlines of Pyrrhonism. And just to jog your memory, you all keep outline of Pyrrhonism next to your bed like I do. That's the right kind of nighttime reading. Sextus says, in order to decide the dispute which has arisen about the criterion of truth, so, right, the problem is, if you're going to be examining natural consciousness, you have to have a criterion to know whether A is true or false. Right? So there's a problem of criterion. What's the criterion by which we judge each form of consciousness? And the problem of criterion is very deep, says Sextus. He says we must possess, in order to judge of any claim, whether it's true or not, an accepted criterion by which we shall be able to judge the dispute. And in order to possess an accepted criterion, the dispute about the criterion must first be decided. So, in order to judge a claim whether it's true or false, we need a criterion. But now we need a criterion to decide which is the right criterion for truth. And when the argument thus reduces itself to a form of circular reasoning, the discovery of the criterion becomes impracticable, since we do not allow those who make knowledge claims to adopt a criterion by assumption. That is, we don't allow dogmatism. You can't just say, well, it's certainty because I say so. Right? We don't think that's a kosher move. While they offer to judge the criterion by a criterion, we force them to a regress ad infinitum. So, give me a criterion for your criterion. Well, I'll judge certainty by faith, and faith by God, and God, infinite regress. And furthermore, since the demonstration requires a demonstrated criterion, while the criterion requires an improved demonstration, they are forced into circular reasoning. That is, to summarize, there looks to be an unsolvable problem about the criterion for truth. For will it not be the case that every criterion is either asserted dogmatically, or, since we don't see how dogmatism is going to work, we force you into a regress, a criterion for the validity of your criterion, a criterion for the validity of that criterion, so that can go on forever, or you end up arguing in a circle, right? The criterion for A is B, and for B is A, and you just go round and round. So it looks like every possible account of criterion is impossible. It's either dogmatic, or an infinite regress, or certain. It looks like this is a big problem. So he raises the question of criterion. He's now raising the very problem which he began the entire book, knowing before you know. Right? How do we know knowledge? And now giving it its pristine logical form. The problem of criterion is the logical repetition of the problem of knowing before you can know. That is, having a criterion of knowledge. Hegel says, we can solve this problem. And we can solve this problem like all good solutions, by dodging it. That is, it's not that he's going to show you he has a criterion that's not dogmatic or circular and infinite regress. He can't do any of that, right? So what he really does have to dodge it in some way, and he's going to say, I'm going to solve the problem by not having a criterion. Well, hold it. How can he have a story about knowledge and truth requires a criterion, and not have a criterion? This is the story of his dialectical method. So he reminds us in paragraph 82 that consciousness simultaneously distinguishes itself from something and at the same time relates itself to it, or as it is said, this something exists for consciousness, and the determinate aspect of this relating, or of the being of something for a consciousness, is knowing. This hardly sounds like a solution to anything. So what is Hegel doing here, or beginning to do here? Well, one of the things he's going to be doing here, or is beginning to do here, is suggest that all consciousness is minimally a form of self-consciousness. By which I mean that he's beginning to suggest that every form of knowing is an activity. So already, I want you to be, you should have large, suspicious ears. You already know that he's saying something that's incompatible with where we're going to begin in sense certainty. Because his first assumption is knowing is an activity. Right? So he's picking up the rationalist Kantian thought that knowing is an activity. And it's an activity of a certain kind. It's an activity in which I distinguish myself from the object, have an awareness of myself, and relate myself back to that object in some respect. So every act of knowing assumes a distinguishing of the subject from the object and a form of their interconnection. So every act of knowing, or anything we will count as an act of knowing, he's going to suggest, is a form in which the object, every act of knowing presupposes that the object is, that consciousness operates with a concept of its object. That when I know, I have an idea about what knowing is, and I have an idea about what the objects of knowing are, and I have an idea about how those two things get hooked up together. Consciousness, we might say, has the power to define or constitute itself in a particular way, and in doing so, it defines what truth is for it and what the standard of truth will be. And this way of talking should ring lots of bells of familiarity, because the very description of consciousness operates on the assumption of Kant's Copernican chair. So I'm going to suggest to you that the structure of Hegel's method is not presuppositionalist, is not about some crazy idea, but rather a generalization of the result of Kant's Copernican turn, or we might say it takes as its starting point the agreed truths of Kantianism for all post-Kantian readers. That is, Hegel is assuming a readership in which everyone agrees that something spectacular happens in the Critique of Pure Reason, and yet, as I said in the first lecture, you can't stay there, right? This knowing appearances, not things themselves, is a form of skepticism. Nonetheless, what Kant convinced his generation of, with the possible exception of Jacobi, was the following. That's the best way to think about knowledge, is to think about judgment. And that all knowledge is a relationship, therefore, between a judgment and an object judged. And that, therefore, remember, this is Kant's solution to the problem of subject-object dualism, is that this relationship is an internal relationship. And it's an internal relationship because what Kant calls the transcendental unity of apperception, the unity of consciousness, is at the same time the idea of a concept of an object in general. That is, what Kant thought is that what he called his categories, the categories by which the knower synthesized, gathered up the information of the senses, and made a judgment, those categories were the outline of what it was for something to be an object. So that Kant's theory provided an account of what judgment was, bringing an intuition under a concept, and gave an account of what the world was like, namely made up of substances in relations of cause and effect in space and time. Now, my suggestion is that this idea, so Kant's fundamental solution here, how he got round rationalism and empiricism, was to show that subject-object are not externally related, but internally related. Right? That they're internally related because every judgment presupposes a series of categorical terms of what an object must be. So if I see an event, to use a kind of typical Kantian example, right, it must have a cause. Right? Even if it's turning water to wine, right? I don't think, ooh, mystery. I think, no, ooh, hidden cause. Let's search. And that's necessitated by my concept of an object. Because what it is for something to be an event is for something to have a cause for cause. Okay? So the Copernican term, this is Kant's advance beyond rationalism empiricism, was to overcome, was to say that subject-object relationship, subject and object were not ontologically different kinds. Res cogitans versus res extensor over here. Although we thought there was cogitans and extensor, but it was kind of irrelevant. Because what he thought was really the case is the relationship between self and world was an internal relationship. Now, Hegel thinks he can help himself to this method because, I mean, first of all, he thinks he can help himself to this method because that's who we are. The problems with our current categorical set are really the dualisms of Kantian philosophy. So if you go back to the first week and I gave you a list of problems, they are just the problems of dualism that Kant failed to solve. The first, that Kantian philosophy hands over, gives to us these dualisms. So he thinks we're already inhabiting that Kantian world. But he also thinks something else. He thinks that it's easy for us to help ourselves to this because our object in our examination is not atoms or frogs, because his method would not work. His method would not work. Would not work easily if the question was, what is it for something to really, really, really be a frog? And the reason why he would have problems convincing us to adopt this for that is because it would be very tempting for us to be realist about frogs. I don't know what the different theories of frogness are, but whatever they are, it's up to the frog. Right? So about ordinary objects in the world, we are all intuitive realists. Right? And it'll be very hard to say, I'm going to help myself to Kantianism and think hard about frogs. But we're not thinking about frogs. He says we're thinking about knowledge. That our object is not about a thing in the world. It's about knowledge. And now, he says, knowledge is the relationship between a subject and object. That is, knowledge, if that's our object, is going to be something like this. That is, it's got to be, knowledge has got to be, if it's going to be something we examine. And now we're able to think with Kantianism with a clear conscience, because whatever your account of knowledge is, you're bound to say knowledge is going to be a relationship between a subject and an object. And we want an account of the relationship between a subject and an object that does not beg the question about what a subject is or what an object is. So what we want for a non-question-begging account of any account of what knowledge may be is to claim that whatever knowledge is, it will be a categorical set of a certain kind. Namely, it will be one that matches up a form of knowing start getting a little Hegelian. So a form of knowing, right, with a concept of an object in general. So what he's doing is taking the idea of Kantianism, dropping all the details about the transcendental unity of our perception, categories, and just thinking about it as a general mapping of a kind of internal relationship, so that every account of knowledge will have a form of knowing, let's say sense certainty, and every form of knowing, so sense certainty, when I say form of knowing, I mean a certain account of what you think knowing is like. So sense certainty says knowing is like having a certain sensory episode. Immediate. There. Got it. So that's its description of what the act or state of knowing is, and that account precipitates or goes along with an account of what is to be known, a concept of an object that is the internal correlate of that form of knowing. What is it for sense certainty, anyone? Concept of an object. This. It's the this. The singular this. Determinate this. Immediacy is the way it happens. What is known is a determinate this. This is. So lo and behold, Hegel's so-called presupposition with starting point turns out to be a little bit mediated. Namely, he's helping himself to the complete Kantian philosophy. That's his starting point. He's starting, in other words, in the middle, which is to say, in his own historical location. So he does not have a presuppositionless starting point. He has a starting point that any of his readers can find methodologically acceptable, above all because it's not bringing with it any of the baggage that everyone worries about with Kant, phenomena, noumena, and all that, nor is it bringing with it any of the technical assumptions, no transcendental unity of perception, nothing. He's just giving you the Copernican turn itself. Just the very idea that we can no longer imagine, right, that our effort as knowers is to approximate ourselves to we know not what, but rather that the activity of knowing involves legislating for nature in some way, right, and then testing that out. So now, if that looks to you intelligible, we are now in a position to dodge the criterion problem. And we're in a position to dodge the criterion problem because sense certainty itself has a criterion of knowledge, namely knowing this. So now I don't have to ask what the criterion of knowledge is. Every form of knowledge will propose its own criterion. Truth is knowledge of the immediate knowledge of this. And now all I have to do is look on and see if sense certainty really is, in its own terms, knowledge of this. So in this respect, we can stand back and observe sense certainty performing its own claim. That is, this is, I always say, phenomenological perception is written in Missouri. Right? It's a show me statement. Right? So, what Hegel says to each form of knowledge is, show me. You say you have immediate knowledge of this, show me. Right? So phenomenology now, Hegel's notion of phenomenology, means I am an observer. I can stand back and let sense certainty perform so that every form of consciousness undergoes a performance. And the performance it's going to do is trying to demonstrate that indeed its knowing really is adequate to its criterion of knowledge. And if sense certainty cannot know this, if it cannot know this, if the very idea of sense certainty, namely its passivity, makes knowing this impossible, it dies. It goes under. Fini. No, not fini completely. Now we get determinate negation. So the determinate negation will be, okay, I now need something else here, and it turns out, I won't go through the story this week, but it's going to turn out in order to know this, I'm going to need universals. So my new concept of an object is going to be a thing with properties. And the kind of knowing that knows things with properties is going to be called perception. So the moment, what happens here, now what allows this reversal to happen, Hegel says, is I realize, or we realize that what was taken to be the this is an in itself. Right, now we'll get Hegel's jargon. So the this is the in itself. And it undergoes this activity of trying to know the in itself. And it discovers that the in itself was not an in itself. It was only an in itself for us. That is, it learns a Kantian lesson. First of all, every form of consciousness is turned into a form of idealism. Idealism gets proved over and over. I'll come back to that in a second. And as soon as I get rid of the this and realize that this was merely my projection of a concept of an object, then we're ready now for a new concept of an object to emerge. Right? And of course, the new concept of an object will have to follow the criteria I laid out before for determinate negation. Namely, it must make good the inadequacies of the previous standpoint. And it turns out that all the problems of sense certainty are problems about no knowledge of intuitions without concepts, no knowledge of particulars without universals. So we're going to have to get universals in there, hence we get our new concept of an object. And that will give us a new notion of knowing. So it turns out that natural consciousness, so each of these is what Hegel calls a form of consciousness, or is a version of natural consciousness. Remember again, natural consciousness is simply the spontaneous espousal of any position without acknowledgement of its historical or logical conditioning. Right? What makes it natural is that, to use it in other ways, we always return to immediacy. We always take where we are to be immediate, which we do. It's not a wild. Natural consciousness has that structure to it. We are blissfully not very self-reflective. If we were, life would be like reading the Phenomenology all the time, and that would be intolerable. And Hegel understands that. So the notion of natural consciousness also has about it, right? There's some necessity to the notion of immediacy. Okay, before I say anything about experience, let me deep breath there, stop, because I've now done all that complicated in itself, for itself stuff under a different accounting. Are there any now questions about this structure? This is what the structure we need to get going, and this is the structure that solves the problem of criterion. Yeah.
I can see how that can get away from an infinite regress, but it seems like there could be like an infinite progress.
It could.
Okay, so that's allowed.
Oh yeah. I mean, as I said, going forward, the phenomenology is a gamble. We don't know it's going to end. We simply have now we can understand what he meant by the goal is already set. The goal is already set when a concept of knowing and a concept of an object no longer enter into contradiction with one another. That's it. So all this stuff, Heidegger says, the absolute wills of self, just crap. Right? Hegel has a perfectly modest, deflationary, formal criterion. You end when everybody's happy internally. That's it. And it may never happen. Don't worry till you get there. So, this tells us something about the structure of the book, and what you must be alert to in reading the book. That is, minimally, the book operates from two perspectives. Namely, so the question is, who is the we? Hegel always says, who is the we? And the best account of this in the literature is still, I think, Kenley Dove's really wonderful essay from 1969 on Hegel's phenomenological method. Gives a wonderful account of all the different accounts of who people think the we is. I've now said the we begins as, and this is observing consciousness, we post-Kantian philosophers. That's who the we initially is. It's we unhappy Kantians. We German idealists who can find no satisfaction. After 15 or 20 weeks in this, you may think, come on, just get a life. Don't worry about it. But we who can find no satisfaction. So the structure of every chapter, so this is going to be important to how the story goes. And this is now moving forward to paragraph 86 further on. There are two perspectives. The perspective of natural consciousness, and the perspective of we, or observing consciousness. say what allows the phenomenology to happen as a phenomenology is because we stand back and watch the various forms of natural consciousness come up, do their little performance, defeat themselves, disappear, and another form of natural consciousness arises. But that's not exactly all that happens, because we are observing this, and so we are keeping track of this story. So in every chapter, there are moments, so every chapter has at least two voices, and when you read each chapter, you must rigorously distinguish between the two voices. The voice of the we, or philosophical consciousness, or observing consciousness, and then the bit where there actually is a phenomenological demonstration. That is, the internal performance of a certain position carried out from the first-person point of view. So there has to be observing consciousness, natural consciousness, and for example, just to look at sense certainty for 1 second. Okay, we're doing good for time. So sense certainty begins, paragraphs 90 through 94, that's all the voice of the philosopher. Right? Hegel's setting it up, telling about this position, saying what he thinks about it. Then, paragraph 95, change of voice. It is this, then, that sense certainty itself must be asked. What is this? All right, and now sense certainty is going to be pressed, right? And there are complications of sense certainty, because sense certainty doesn't want to talk. We will have to make it talk, and have a lot of arguments about whether this is a form of epistemological terrorism or whatever, whether this is coercive. Feuerbach thought it was an illegitimate act of coercion of sense certainty. I'll say a lot about Feuerbach's complaints next week. So this question of voices is terribly important. And in sense certainty, it has lots of problems. So sense certainty looks to be very easy, but you can get very worked up about it. And maybe now that I've told you can, you all will come in and be very worked up about it. But all I want to say here is, notice the two voices. The shift from the philosophical voice to the phenomenological voice of natural consciousness. The only account I know of that gives a breakdown of the entire book in terms of these two voices is as an appendix to Kojel's Introduction to the Reading of Hegel. The appendix breaks down every bit of the book and asks who's talking. Is it the philosopher talking, or is it a phenomenological demonstration? So this is at least a two-voice book. At some point, observing consciousness had better have a moment of recognition. That is, at some point, the philosopher better say something like, "Ooh, that's me!" Right? So it has, that moment like Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, where he suddenly sees his hometown in a movie. I said, wait a minute, you mean it exists? Right? My hometown's a character in the movie. So at a certain moment, you who have thought yourself beyond this process have to, as it were, have a moment where, as in any narrative, you identify with the hero or heroine, and you too must go under. So that much of the structure of the book is also about the relationship between these two. It's not just a hands-off one, because after all, it is natural consciousness that must get to the point of being able to write the book. But observing consciousness, in a certain sense, has always already written the book. So in a certain way, the ending must involve necessarily a synthesis of the points of view of observing consciousness and natural consciousness, or what is the same. Right? Or to say it another way, there's no such thing as an omniscient narrator. There's no framed narrative, or to say it in another way, what my first book was about, on conscious theory of the novel. The biographical form, this is the biography, the story, the life of natural consciousness, for us moderns, always precipitates an autobiographical form. All biography, as we know, is already always autobiography. We can't. Why? Because we can't get rid of the first-person perspective. Right? There's a necessity to the first person for us. So 2 points of view. But something else is going on here between these two perspectives. Hegel talks about experience. He says on page 86, after laying out this structure of now self-comparison, that's why it's a phenomenology. He says, now notice, I have said all of this, I never once mentioned thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or mentioned the phrase dialectical method of thesis. If you say that in a paper or in the class, you fail. Okay? We're done with that. There is no such thing. There is a logic of experience. So whatever you thought Hegel was about, that's what you come here for. You're in the wrong class. Go take physics. You may do that in physics. We don't do that here. Lenin aside. Inasmuch as the new true object issues from it, this dialectical movement, and the dialectical movement now is discovering that, again, what was in itself isn't in itself for us. Hence, the changing of our understanding of ourselves, because what we thought was in the world was not in the world, but in our conception of the world. Hence, we have to redescribe ourselves as knowers. And as soon as we redescribe ourselves as knowers, we have precipitated a new concept of an object in general. That's the movement. Inasmuch as the new true object issues from it, that is, the comparison and the defeat, this dialectical movement, which consciousness exercises on itself, sense certainty does this to itself. I don't do it to it. It does it to itself, discovers it cannot be satisfied. There's no internal correlation. It is forced to go under. And which affects both its knowledge and its object. It cannot be sense certainty, and its object cannot be this. Is precisely what is called experience. Ephemeral. Experience is first the loss of the world. The primary experience is learning from suffering. That's what he means by experience. The suffering here is, why lose the world? Because for all the world, if I believe in sense certainty, I think I am a certain individual, and I'm connected to the world by my immediate relation to this is. And if that breaks down, I have nothing. I have nothing. I've lost it all. That is, I've lost the categorical set that constituted my relationship to the world. Right? That's what this is supposed to be. It's not just a little bit of knowledge. Right? The sense certain person thinks, no, this is how human beings, quasi-human beings, are in the first instance, in their deepest stratum, connected to the world. If they're not connected to the world like this, they're not connected to the world, and everything is nothing. Each form of consciousness has that deep, hyperbolic structure. Hence, the breakdown is, in the first instance, this loss of the world. But it is also the emergence, Hegel says, of the new object. Now, the problem here is that the way things go for natural consciousness is, in fact, not very tidy. And what I mean by that is the following. Think about Kuhnian paradigm shifts. Kuhn says, look, paradigms go along happily, and then anomalies start to accumulate. And anomalies accumulate and accumulate, and he says, whoa, there's a crisis. That crisis can last forever. Nothing needs to end the crisis. In fact, for some people, the crisis never ends. But for some others, say those who suddenly discover Newton, they wake up one morning and the world's just fine. They're Newtonians. Now, for them, for the Newtonians, what their sense of themselves is, the world's a Newtonian whole, we're confident of this, and they carry on. What they don't see is the relationship between their Newtonianism and the pre-Newtonian Ptolemaic, or whatever is going to be your pre-Newtonian position. That is, they don't see their position as arising out of a reversal of the growing anomalies in the previous position. They just think, woof, we're Newtonians, and we can see what's wrong with those pre-Newtonians. Only us historical observers understand that position B emerges out of the reversal of position A. So Hegel says, paragraph 87, this is terribly important, that what I'm trying to suggest here is natural consciousness undergoes a series of conversion experiences. An experience is a conversion. You wake up one morning and you're a Newtonian. Some of you woke up one morning and you said, I'm a Heideggerian, I'm 11. You wake up, you don't rustle and you get the half. No, it's not the way change happens. Change happens by conversion. By turning around. Why? Because what typically, as Hegel says, what allows us to move on is being in possession of a new truth. So before the new truth arose, we couldn't do anything. We were in crisis. Once we had the new truth, the crisis was gone. So we somehow are never in the position of seeing the connection between crisis and resolution. We might say that seeing it as a pattern of crisis and resolution is to see it as an education. And that is what Hegel says observing consciousness adds to the story. That is, we have these blocks of natural consciousness going through these terrible experiences, and what we add is an understanding of them as a movement from A to B to C and so on. Right? We see them as a progress and an education. That is, we see them as a learning sequence or a developmental sequence. Which is to say that, for the most part, learning and development happen behind our backs. Think about your own, wrestling with a hard philosophical text. You struggle and struggle and struggle, and you finally give up. And you kind of come back 6 months later and you're reading this, and you think, wait a minute, I understand this. How come? How do I suddenly, why did I find this so difficult? Very rarely, so that learning happens in quantum leaps, for the most part, and only retrospectively do we see learning, right? Do we understand that learning has happened, that is part of the developmental sequence, and the like. The rare examples of this are practicing skills, where you can kind of feel, often day to day, you're getting a hold of it. So experience, for Hegel, is learning through suffering, that the forward movement is always a movement of conversion, that it is an abductive inference only for the observer, and for the observer, it is a developmental sequence. Once you have that, then it's fair to say that what the phenomenology is an account of the experience of consciousness, which was the original subtitle of the book, right? The science of the experience of consciousness. But now we know that the experience of consciousness means the whole history of all those experiences by which modern self-consciousness has been constituted in a certain way. And what it means to grasp that. Okay. That's the introduction. That's going to be the way that the book works. It's phenomenological method, it's theory of experience. I've given you an account of the we. I've claimed that it's not a presupposition with a starting point. It's a book. So that you don't feel yourself in any way tempted by Kantianism, you will find this book unreadable. And you will. I know lots of people find this book unreadable. And it's perfectly clear why. So it is heavily conditioned by its own history. So it starts in the middle, which means, again, it must, at some point, catch up with its own starting point. So this structure, what's called the fundamental structure of self-consciousness, must actually emerge at some point in the story and be an object. And as I would suggest, it actually emerges very early on, as you might expect. It's the transition between chapter 3 and 4. Consciousness to self-consciousness. Okay, questions?
At which point the we begins to see itself implicated in the losses it's observed along the way.
Not initially, not quite. Yes and no. One of the things that's going to happen is, as is already clear, I am assuming that the Copernican position is fundamentally a view about knowledge. As I'll explain more next week, in my reading of the text, the first 3 chapters are a genealogy of self-consciousness. And they're for the sake of discovering that self-consciousness is not a theoretical mode of consciousness at all. And self-consciousness is always already practical. So the first transition is actually going to discover that we're not knowers, we're agents. So we'll start to identify in certain ways with this. But we won't, so there'll be moments of identification, but also moments of disidentification. We get to self-consciousness, but then suddenly we're talking about the unhappy consciousness, or we're talking about crazy people beating themselves, and other people going on looking for a bit of Christ's cross. Why would they do that? I mean, really nutty forms of behavior all over the place. And we don't think we're like that. And so we're going to have a hard time identifying with all these characters. And yet all these characters are going to be incipient versions of us, and therefore, that's going to be the difficulty of the reading, which is to say, like someone, I think it was Manola Dargis, was talking about Helen Mirren portraying Elizabeth. See, Helen Mirren has the greatness to portray truly unattractive people who are just intensely dislikable. And she knows we will like her anyway. Well, there's something about that natural consciousness, as Hegel does it, is like a Helen Mirren. That it goes through these forms that we are both repulsed by, and yet must somehow identify with. And that's going to be part of the tension of the book. Part of the difficulty in my teaching the book is what? We must feel, and this is really the trick of reading the book, you should feel for each form of consciousness a moment when you're just tempted to say, even for 1 second, okay, I can just about say, that could be a world. You have to have that much of the capacity for empathic identification. You're implicated. Yeah. And the book makes that, but I'm saying that the book makes that question of self-implication difficult. Right? And that difficulty is doubled by the fact that these two are held apart in a way throughout, only at certain moments to undergo certain implications. Yeah?
Understood your account of the relationship between consciousness. It seems it capable of being the motor of historical progress in that way, whereas
unhappiness.
So then observing consciousness, the structural relatedness of observing consciousness is always is necessary to the extent that it's always already happy. We're to believe that observing consciousness is...
No, that's right. You asked, the first question was, what gives natural consciousness the oomph to go forward? My answer is unhappiness. That Hegel takes seriously the thought that as human beings, not as philosophers, but as human beings, we require some sort of satisfactory categorical articulation of our being in the world. That is, we have to have, let me say what that means. I'm saying, and I think this is Kant's great insight. Kant understands, and Hegel is going to follow him here, that to be a human being is to have a picture of yourself and a picture of the world, and have an account of the relationship between yourself and the world. To have such an account of self and world is to have a philosophical position. That is, that gives you what it means to be a human being, what it means to have a world, and therefore they have to, if you're to be in any way intelligible to yourself as a human being, in harmony with one another. Because unless they are in harmony with themselves, right, then my world is incoherent and I have no direction, I don't know how to act, I don't know how to not act, I don't know how to do anything. So this categorical set articulates how I am to navigate the world in general. Okay? Now, therefore, by what Hegel does is take these structures and condenses them to their categorical essentials. Right? Takes them out of the messy business of the life world, condenses them to their categorical essentials, and then forces, in a certain sense, their inhabitants to enact their meaning. Right? And therefore, natural consciousness is going to have to make sense of itself in relationship to its own account of the world. The failure of that really is the loss of self and loss of world. So the stakes here are immensely high. So when I say unhappiness is the motor, I mean that you might say nihilism is the motor, or anxiety is the motor. All these sorts of things that are our general way that we have to make sense of the world. Right? And of course, the difference between this and everyday life is here it's all stripped of ideology, of practical necessities, all the things that protect us from the fragility of our categorical sets. Right? Mostly our categorical sets aren't under the kind of intense pressure that they're under here. And only at certain moments in history, or at certain moments in our lives, do our categorical sets come under intense pressure. So, you thought that love was going to save you and be the meaning of your life. You fall in love, you get married, you're madly in love with your husband or wife, and you're not satisfied. You're not satisfied. And that means that love cannot be what you thought it was as a form of being in the world, and you require some other access to the world. So at certain moments in our lives, those things we most value, most think anchor us, most orient us, break apart. They do so historically in revolution, and so on. So it's unhappiness that's the motor. The job of observing consciousness is to acknowledge that this process of going under and new forms arising itself is not arbitrary, and it has a meaning and structure. So natural consciousness, right, didn't have the thought of history. I mean, history is a very new category for us human beings. So this notion that we're constituted historically is a new thought, and that our lives can be, various frameworks. All these are new thoughts. And Hegel is, as it were, one of the first ones to try to make sense of it. Hamlet may be the first person to suffer it. Right? That's my reading of Hamlet, right? He suffers the loss of frameworks. The discovery that frameworks are just frameworks is Hamlet's terrifying discovery. And then he has to make sense of life without a framework. That's what he thinks subjectivity means. And that's what Hamlet means as play. Right? And it turns out you can't do it. So Hegel wants to set this structure up. So Hegel really does think this is the structure of not just knowing, as it turns out, but of what it is to be a human being in the world, of which knowing turns out to be, the book starts here, one of the worst, most thinnest, most uninteresting, most stupid ways of thinking about what a human being is. I'm a knower. I represent the world. Whatever made someone think? Well, there's a long story here. And the answer, by the way, there is an answer. And the answer is natural science. Discovery of natural science is a good answer to why, for a certain moment, we thought of ourselves as pure knowers. I don't have an answer for Plato and Aristotle, but that's why we modernists might think that. Hegel's convinced that's a bad answer, and he gets rid of it in the first 3 chapters. Epistemology's first philosophy. Done in 100 pages. 500 pages to go, so we know anything about that. So whatever philosophers have been doing for the last 250 years, mistake. Does that kind of help?
Yes. Would it then be fair to say that in order for natural consciousness to perform its role as historical motor, it needs to contain a moment of unconsciousness of historicity of its particular form?
No. That's the job of observing consciousness. Observing consciousness. So that's why I said natural consciousness can be happy in thinking that it's immediate.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
But it doesn't need that extra. We can allow it. It's naturalness. We add to it that it is historically conditioned and see it as historically conditioned. Therefore, minimally, now, for each form of consciousness, there are minimally 2 descriptions. It's self-description, and it's description as seen by observing consciousness as historically conditioned. And there'll be a third description, namely, as seen by us at the end of the story. Right? So, just to remind you, I was just talking about the break of Arthur Danto's idea of what makes sentences historical sentences. And he says historical sentences are sentences that have 2 descriptions, of which cannot be both had at all times. So in 1619, I think it's 1619, no one knew that it was the beginning of the 30 Years' War. Or no one knew with the fall of Dien Bien Phu that this was going to be the beginning of America's being dragged into Vietnam and ending up in a disaster. So beginnings you can describe beginnings in one way as they're seen by their protagonists, and in another way as seen by us at the end. And Hegel is saying there's actually another way, namely as seen by us in the middle, as moving toward the end. So each form of natural consciousness will have 3 descriptions. Its own self-description, this is who I am and this is how I see myself. Our description of it, so we see perception as the successor state to sense certainty, trying to make good sense certainty, and then we'll see what the this looks like at the end, and it will turn out that other forms of consciousness will look a lot like perception, because the problem of the perception is going to be the problem of one and many, and it turns out there are a lot of forms of consciousness that get caught up in the problem of the one and the many, because that's one of the things most philosophers think about. Is that? Okay, for those of you who have to capture trains to faraway places, and to me, so next week, probably read uncertainty and perception at the rate we're going. Let's hope we get to some certainty.